beavers have raised the water level such that these cottonwoods on the other side of the marsh have drowned and died off. We're going to go over there and stick in some silverleaf maple. So here's the plan. We've got 25 bare root silver maples and Endomaxima mycorrhizal fungi inoculant that I'll apply to the roots of these as I plant them. The reason that we're going in with this silver maple is that it tolerates a lot of moisture. And so out here in zone 4.5, you could say, of this permaculture design, I'm rarely out here and I don't want to have to water and care for a tree species that I put out here. So I'm going to plant it in this environment where it should take off on its own without any intervention. And the reason we're using the silver maple is that not only is it water tolerant, but it's also a sugarable maple, which means that you can collect the sap from it and cook it down to make maple syrup. Now, compared to the sugar maple, the silver maple requires twice as much reduction to get to suitable syrup. So 60 to 1, so 60 gallons of sap from these will produce 1 gallon of maple syrup, as compared to the sugar maple, which will produce 1 gallon with 30 gallons of sap. So it's going to take more reduction to get a usable product out of it, but worth doing here, where in colder climates the sugar maple produces well. This should produce well in a slightly warmer climate. It's also very tolerant to coppicing, and so if the beavers come up here and want to chew on them, that's fine. And it should be a pretty no maintenance species to add to this polyculture, which is mostly Russian olive and cottonwood at this point. The Russian olive also don't mind having wet roots, so they're doing fine back here. And the cottonwood is progressively dying back as the beavers raise the water level. So there are some wood areas along where the pond fingers are here, and I'll just plant these along the edges of that, and we'll see how they do. We've got deer scat on top of cow manure. There's also a herd of elk that winter out down here. Pretty good spot. You can see what's going on here. All these trees are drowned out. It's cottonwood. Was gnawed off and left for dead. And all of this is about 12 feet in elevation above the Gunnison River, which is rushing the spring runoff right now. Cows are wondering what the heck I'm doing. where the magic happens. Whole family of beavers in there. They keep about 2 seasons worth of young with them at any given time. They're out here farming all these cattails, reeds, duckweed. Over on the other side of the beaver pond system, we're going to go in with these hazelnuts. I soak the roots and treat them with the mycorrhizal. The thinking on the mycorrhizal being one of 2 types of mycorrhizal fungi, endo and exo mycorrhizal. This one is supposedly going to actually enter into the cells of the plant and form a symbiotic relationship that is apparently at the discretion of the root plant. And should they sync up, it will then create a fungal hyphae network that will bring not only water but nutrients and minerals to these plants. So essentially be extensions of the root that are intelligent and can find whatever minerals and nutrients are going to make these plants produce the highest quantity of exudase, which is a simple carbohydrate sugar-like sweat that comes off these roots that the mycorrhizal will live on. And so therefore the symbiotic relationship is complete. The fungi are feeding the plants are feeding the fungi, and that should give them the greatest chance to succeed out here. So I'm going to plant these along this hillside. This mesa here is where my alfalfa pasture is, so I irrigate that. So there's sub-irrigation all the way down here. And so I'm going to plant these in a row down here right at the edge of the mesa, and that should give them a pretty good shot. So why am I planting all of these trees? There are a myriad of reasons why it's a good idea to plant trees. Primary among them, the hydrological effect of a tree in the ground can't really be overstated. A tree is a pump. So you can use trees, a line of them going up a hill, for example, to move water uphill against its nature. Water will always fall perpendicular to the contour, but if you have a tree system, you can actually move that water up the hillside through the action of the roots and also through the transpiration of the leaves. So these trees are constantly exhaling water as part of their biological process. So that's increasing the humidity, and in the morning time you can actually see more dew on the ground around a tree. So they definitely have a very positive effect in getting the water out of the ground with a non-mechanical and natural means and applying it to the topsoil in your system. They're also producing a tremendous amount of organic matter in the form of leaves and fruit that are not only fodder for animals, both domestic and wild, but also in the fall, they fall on the ground, they protect the soil with a mulch layer, and then the biology within the soil can incorporate that organic matter into the soil, and the higher your organic matter, the higher your fertility. I heat my home with wood. And so if you're going to be burning wood, it makes sense to continue planting trees so that you have wood going forward. I greatly prefer using wood as a heat source rather than, say, a fossil fuel, because that puts me within the current solar cycle for my fuel needs, for my energy needs. So it's something that I can replace, whereas if I'm buying natural gas to run a furnace, well, that's a whole different arrangement where, you know, you're using a finite resource when you could be using a renewable, replaceable resource. It's a building material, and so like planting these black walnuts, they actually have a marketable value because the wood is so prized. Pecans, you know, the chestnuts and hickories and things like that we've put in could be cabinet grade wood in the future, and a lot of these other species, the locusts and things like that, make great tool wood. Black locust is extremely hard, and when you're using that as a fuel wood, for example, it's more like burning coal than it is burning wood. So having the building material for myself and for future generations and things like that is another good reason. Of course, there's a food resource. This is a crab apple, so not a very high food value, but definitely food value for the wild animals around here. The deer come down here, and boy, if you can turn crab apples into venison, then you got something there too. But not all the species I plant have a food value, but there are certainly other reasons to stick them in. Fodder for the animals. One can take a lot of these trees, like these cottonwoods and the poplars and the willows, are great fodder for grazing livestock in the wintertime. You can make something called tree hay. You can harvest saplings, you know, coppice off all of the plants at ground level, dry that, and then stack it, and then you can use that to feed your animals in the winter. And then the next year, all of that new growth will come from that root system, and you can repeat that process year over year over year. Coppicing being cutting to the ground, pollarding being cutting to about head height for hedgerows and things like that. The shade that trees provide cools the temperature of the soil and slows down the transpiration and evaporation of water out of the soil into the atmosphere, as well as providing habitat for wild animals. Windbreak, you know, the more you can slow the wind down, the less evaporation you can have. And these things are particularly of concern in my high desert environment, where we get typically 12 to 15 inches of rain per year. So we're very conscious about conserving every last bit of that in the soil, because water is necessary for life. Water is the highest medicine. Where it is, there is life. Where it is not, there is nothing. And even in the compost heap, for example, all of that biology is happening within a film of water, whether it's in the compost or in the ground, and it's that health and vitality of the soil that provides for everything else. I also planted about 85 elm trees, which a lot of people think are a junk tree. I personally love them. They're my favorite fuel wood, and they grow fast. They're very adaptive to a variety of types of soil. Super easy to propagate from seed, and the local elm trees put on a bunch of seed every year, and that one you can just take it and put it in the ground, and boy, it'll grow. The trees that I put up by the highway are all ones that I cleared out of the beds in my garden when I was prepping it for the spring. So I go in there with a broad fork and loosen the soil and pull out all of the elms that germinated from last year. And so I put them in up along the turnout on the highway. We had 4 kids in a car roll over and come off of that cliff into the creek behind the house last October. Unfortunately, there were 2 fatalities in that accident. But as a guardrail up there, and also a privacy screen, super easy to just put elms in there and not have to build a fence or do anything like that. Just put those elm seedlings in, and most of them are taken off. So that's another good use. Carbon offset. Now, Personally, I'm not concerned about 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, but according to Penn State, approximately 730 trees offset the fossil fuel carbon emissions of one person for their lifetime. So if you plant 730 trees and they all survive to maturity, you are carbon neutral if you live a typical American lifestyle. My lifestyle is already carbon negative because of the way that I produce my own food. I'm putting more carbon into the soil than I'm releasing into the atmosphere in the production of it. So, you know, not really a concern for me on any of those levels, but just as an interesting statistic to throw out there. The other thing about carbon hysteria is that we have a carbon market developing, which is really part of the aim of those who are most involved in pushing a climate narrative. So by planting trees, you may in the future, and actually in the present, you can sell carbon offsets in the carbon market. And so all of that is being fleshed out with companies popping up to do a census of carbon sequestration, and you know, it's going to be a huge mess, but also a potential income source in the future. The more trees you have, the better off you are on many levels. So the other things that that trees do, some species like this catalpa back here, are nitrogen fixers, and so they mine nitrogen out of the atmosphere, which is mostly nitrogen, and fix it in nodules in a symbiotic relationship with the bacterium in the soil. And so you have more plant food in your soil when you have these nitrogen fixing plants in the ground. So things like locust, black locust, honey locust, these catalpas, other varieties will actually help you that way as well, providing habitat for various animals. Just in one slice of the ecological picture here, because we have this marsh, we have a great deal of mosquitoes because it's slow moving water, perfect breeding grounds. Well, the most effective thing in handling the mosquito population are tree swallows. And so the more trees you have for them to nest in, the more inclined they will be to be in the area. And so for my own comfort, great to have that habitat. But all of the, you know, fauna in the area make use of these trees, and so that's also very important. Now, the approach that I'm using in planting these trees, these bare root trees, a lot of these can be had for $1 a stem, in that range. So, hey, for less than $1,000, you could offset your lifetime carbon footprint. Just putting that out there. But I'm not gingerly babying these plants. I'm using Mark Shepard's stun method: strategic, total, utter neglect. So I'm planting in areas where strategically there is a high likelihood of survival for the plant, but after that it's on its own. And the reason that's a powerful technique is because then you're allowing the natural environment to select the genetics that are most suited for your region. So every hazelnut tree is going to have its own unique genetic profile, and if I put a bunch of them in and I plant 25 and 5 survive, well, now those 5 are shown to have a genetic predisposition to be able to survive in this ecosystem. So once I have that, then I can propagate those either from cutting or from seed to have a higher likelihood of success in this arid high desert condition. A lot of these trees are more support species than a prized cultivar of a particular fruit or nut or something like that. And just having the support species in is going to change the environment for subsequent plantings of more expensive trees. Like if you spend $150 on a fairly mature sour cherry tree, if it's going into a system that already has that hydrological action of the other roots, it already has the organic matter from the leaf litter, from the other trees, it's going to have a greater chance of success. So my pattern is to put in support species first and see how things are going. Then I can better select locations for more expensive, higher food value trees down the road. As far as selecting native or non-native, to me, as long as it's not an invasive species, if it's not one that tends to want to run, then I have no problem putting non-natives into the system, because the one thing that is true about climate change is that the climate is always changing. And therefore, if you have a variety of species that aren't hurting any of the other species in your system, you have a greater likelihood, regardless of how things change, of having something that's going to do well going into the future. My philosophy then is to put in trees every year, and I end up being in an exercise of radical abundance acceptance sometimes, because I have friends and associates like Jake Tackiff up at Cedar Springs Farm, and he works with Mark Shepard, and so not only has he been a long time big-time tree planter, but now he's doing it at commercial scales in these installations that Restoration Agriculture Development is doing. And so he orders a lot of trees. Sometimes there are surplus trees from big plantings that make their way back here. Some of Mark's hybrid chestnuts are up there around the alfalfa pasture. And so he's always giving me trees. He likes to be Plant-A-Claus and come by the farm, and in the middle of my preparations for spring planting, all of a sudden dump another 500 trees on me. And so the homesteading life has that event happen frequently, where somebody says, oh hey, my tomatoes are blowing up, can you make use of 5 cases of tomatoes? And so learning to say yes and adjust to that bounty and all of that, it's an interesting transition away from a culture that is fundamentally predicated on scarcity. So the whole economic system that I was raised in is about scarcity and supply and demand. The less there is of something, the more valuable it is. The money is based on debt. Everyone's in debt. And to get out of debt and into a community of producers, well, now all of a sudden you're going to have these events frequently where a tremendous amount of something is going to fall into your lap all at once. And then the personal character test is then to rearrange your schedule around it, make the highest best use of it that you possibly can, and proceed on with your life until the next time a great deal of abundance is bestowed upon you. So it's an interesting mental exercise to adjust to a different worldview of abundance, rather than scarcity. So that's how a lot of these trees come to me. And of course, I also try to then, with what I'm unable to plant, if I have an excess of something, share it with the neighbors. And so then, by utilizing the community, we're also planting in a lot of different micro regions, microecologies and whatnot in the valley. And somebody might have something that really takes off on their farm that I have a hard time growing down here. And now we've got it in our local gift economy, and that doesn't hurt anybody. So it's a good thing to plant trees. I encourage you to do so, and I will keep you posted when good things happen with these ones we put in this spring. And thanks for watching.